organized in elections to advocate for change. And as we all know, on the 5th, we saw one sweeping electoral victory. On the 6th, we saw some really hard confrontations of where we make our policy and where we root our political selves. And yet we don't want to neglect and negate the work of so many folks to sort of advocate and do the work that we think can make change. And I love that last line of that film: if we work together, we can win. And so we're holding those tensions and really getting to turn our attention to the work that's still ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and from the film and from your own personal experience of working in communities, I'm curious how you see the intersections between pollution and environmental justice. Of course, we saw a lot of reference to that in the film itself, but I'm just curious about your own experience and what you've seen.
Oh, yeah. The film was heartbreaking as I sort of watched that scene where the car is driving through the St. John's the Baptist parish, and every house of the neighbors pointed out as someone that has been afflicted by cancer. I mean, that is a real thing in a lot of lives, and even in mine. I remember driving through the South and with my parents' friends going, "Oh, how strange how many of the aunties or the cousins in this whole side of the street have had asthma or cancer, or even sometimes waterborne illnesses." So this film sort of puts a fine point on the places where we can suffer alone in silence, but really having people help organize and help put names to what you're suffering from helps people advocate for change. And I'm from North Carolina, from Eastern North Carolina, a place where the intersection of longtime racial policies, be it from land use, be it from toxic pollutants put more in African-American communities than in other communities, and added to the unfortunate effects of climate change, can made this horrible soup that affects the poor, that affects minorities, that affects immigrants more than others. And so this film really, it hurt my heart to see the pain and the struggles that people have to go through before they can organize and realize that together we can win, but we've got to get to that place of having that voice. But yeah, I recognize those houses and I recognize those types of neighborhoods throughout the Southern United States and places where people of color have been sort of victimized for so long.
I remember a few years ago, the first time I went on a toxic tour, and it happened to be in Detroit, not in the South, but it happened to be in Detroit, and really being struck by the very clear distinction in terms of where chemical facilities were located, where refineries were located. And, to the point of some of those featured in the film, there's really not much choice. They don't have the means to pack up and move, and no one wants to buy a home in that community. And so there's a lot of stuckness that goes on with that. And I'm curious, because we know that there's so much structural racism that is part of the history of where these facilities are located, and these, as you heard some of those young people mention, sort of just feeling like a disposable community, a throwaway community. I wonder how you would reflect on structural racism as a part of the legacy of pollution in this country.
Oh my goodness, yes. That phrase, disposable people, if you had to sort of draw a picture of what structural racism, of what systemic racism looks like in a body, in a human body, or in the environment, that idea that some people are disposable is a key part of that picture. We know that whenever municipalities throughout American history have been able to make decisions about where things should go that are harmful, they tend to go with the people who are disposable on their side, like lacking power, lacking voice. And so over and over again, it just amplifies the way existing oppressions and structural racism play out in communities. And that could come from zoning. It could also come from municipalities, systems, and the sort of things that people use for life, the ability to have clean water, the ability to monitor and being close to places of monitoring clean air or runoff. Over and over again, cities and state governments will make decisions that just rely on systemic racist patterns of the past. And it does put people at so much risk. And it does say that some people are disposable. The essence of Black Lives Matter, some lives are less important. Yeah.
You've named some really already some incredible ways for people to get involved in this issue, because those who are joining us this evening, they live in communities, they live in places where there are zoning laws and where municipalities, city councils are making decisions, and paying attention, making sure that you understand what is happening in your community, and where there are fights that you can stand alongside those communities and be allies in the fight, I think is really, really important. And it's a good thing for us to lift up this evening.
Absolutely. I'm so excited because at this time where we're seeing people thinking about what oppression is and thinking intersectionally. We don't live in a bubble. I love that phrase. We all are affected by the Clean Air Act, no matter what you do, all the time. The same thing when we think about justice in our communities, the fight against poverty, the fight against climate change, the fight against environmental pollution are all really intersected and involved together, as well as the fight against racism. And so you've got movements happening, be it the Poor People's Campaign, be it Interfaith Power and Light, where people are realizing that all of these work together. And so as we articulate how we all have a right to clean air and a healthy environment, and that even COVID is a health and environmental issue at the same time, we are all learning the language and getting ourselves in a place where we know if we come together, we can win and make real change.
Absolutely. That's so well said. And I'm curious, here we are at the tail end of this administration, and wondering how you have seen the Trump EPA further entrenching issues of pollution and climate injustice during the past 4 years.
Yeah, unfortunately, as we've all seen, what we've experienced was more than just neglect, but sort of active ways of pulling apart the pieces of the National Environmental Policy Act and the laws that keep us safe. There have been 60 years of people advocating to sort of undo the effects of environmental racism. And in the Trump administration, rolling back the quality air issues, the idea of the taking out sort of the Clinton era regulations about smog emissions, about industrial polluters, have actually pushed ourselves further and further back. And yet we're not without hope that a lot of these rule changes will be able to be overturned by the new administration, and that some of the places in which we can invest in local communities that might have been taken away. Are there places for small cleanup grants? Are we having places where people in the South or rural communities can get environmental justice acts? We can refund those and sort of undo some of the damage of the Trump administration. And I think we will. Yeah.
Well, and that's the perfect segue to my next question, which is, as we look to the inauguration of a new president and vice president tomorrow, and new EPA administrator coming in, new people in the administration, what are your hopes for what we could see in advancing environmental justice principles?
Oh, excellent. I hope that at the very baseline, as a person of faith, I love that we are adopting faith language to sort of encapsulate that. We want to make sure that the vulnerable people on the front lines are supported first, and funding and in environmental regulation acts. We want to accelerate the changes to clean energy and a clean economy, because that benefits all of us, people who are breathing air and all of us who need to work. We want to invest hopefully investing in grants and in jobs and in training and in infrastructure that will affect those who are really vulnerable and all of us as well, and help folks who are transitioning, because I love the discussion of so much in that movie about places where states are wedded, a lot of places, to oil and gas. But if we can help make that transition to clean jobs, to clean energy, it will impact people who are working and as well as people who are in the surrounding environment. So I hope that when the Biden administration promises that their environmental and anti-racist campaign work is going to be woven throughout the administration, that they deliver in lots of different ways to make that happen.
Yeah, and it really does seem that way from everything that we've seen so far. The fact that he's bringing back Gina McCarthy to kind of oversee on the domestic side, that there's alignment between federal agencies on climate and environmental justice, I think is just it gives me a lot of hope that we're really serious about moving forward. And of course, there's a lot of damage that's been done that we need to undo, and that's going to take some time. But also the fact that it's a much more hopeful picture of who's going to be in making decisions. And I want to ask you, what gives you hope in the midst of all of these challenges that we face?
I'm hopeful, and I'm really excited because I've seen that in the face of obstacles, we are still managing to raise up an entire generation of very articulate and aware young Americans who can point to the places where they know they can look for, they're very passionate about protecting the environment, fighting the issues of climate change, and also really aware of structural environmental racism. And so I am hopeful that those people will find both voices and ways to make all of our needs met in the new administration, and still being able to do the advocacy on the outside as well. I see so much potential as we've learned to fight and fight well, and that we can really help the administration galvanize for all of our interests. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And you have such I think, a unique position within the Episcopal Church. I don't know, I'm not sure anyone else that I'm aware of holds the same title that you hold within the Episcopal Church. And I'm really struck by the way that sort of creation care, justice, and reconciliation are woven together within your framework and your position. And so that gives me a lot of hope. And I'm curious if you could describe that a little bit for folks. Just maybe it'll spur some others on to look at things in a similar fashion.
Yeah, I am so privileged to be able to do this, and I pull together two currents of desire for change and to do the work of making the world a better place within the Episcopal Church. So I am both the director of racial reconciliation and broader issues of justice, including anti-poverty and creation care. And both of those have been part of the current of what the denomination has asked for over the years. But in 2018, they put enough money behind both of them at the same time, and with the amazing leadership of Presiding Bishop Michael Curry, to say that we're a movement and we are about making the just world happen, the Jesus movement, as we call it. And so, yeah, it's able to help us speak across the line. So now when the church gives grants for people who are doing creative things to end racism, we're able to look at and fund those who are thinking specifically about environmental racism. Similarly, when we're talking about folks who really want to make a difference for the environment, we're able to help train leaders, give workshops, help people understand that the ways of climate change will leave some people out, and sometimes those most vulnerable people are people of color. And so being able to have those conversations to make people who are really literate in all forms of not just oppression and injustice, but of ways of changing the system and changing the world is really exciting. And it's a great thing for the church to be able to do as well.
That's beautiful. we tend to like our issues in silos, I think, and we're learning more and more that they don't exist there, and the
Yep,
solutions have to bring these together as well. And so, I think that's
that's
amazing
right.
that the presiding bishop's office created that position, and of course, I think they have a stellar person in that role, and I so appreciate your work. And I want to go ahead and bring Bill into this conversation too. Um, Bill, you've been tracking EPA rulemaking for several years, and I wonder if you could share some challenges that IPL and our partners have seen over the past 4 years, especially with regards to clean cars, methane, and if you want to touch on the Clean Power Plan too. But I'd love to hear your take on those challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last 4 years, to put it bluntly, have been difficult. We've constantly been playing defense, and that's psychologically a difficult place to be. But we have a new opening, and we have a chance to really make some serious progress. But we need people to be on board with us because we've got to have a lot of voices, and we want to have a real strong interfaith community to make those changes. So specifically talking about the last 4 years, the Trump administration has rolled back the clean car standards, weakening fuel efficiency and tailpipe pollution standards for cars and trucks. That's critical because transportation at large is the biggest source of climate pollution currently in the United States. Second, replacing the Clean Power Plan with something far weaker, which is dismantling protections for mercury and other air toxics from coal-fired power plants. And we'll talk a little bit about that, a little more about that soon, because there was an important announcement about that today. But the third big thing that we've been tracking for the past few years is the methane safeguards. And the Trump administration has removed the limits on dangerous methane leaks for oil and gas operations. And this is harming not only the climate from the global warming pollution that the methane is causing, but also those local communities and the health impacts that are happening in those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill, we should mention as we go along, of course, that many of the folks who have joined us this evening have been a part of these campaigns with us over the years, and we so appreciate all of your advocacy work and standing together on this. And also our state affiliates around the country who have been so involved at the very local level on these fights, whether it has been showing up at EPA hearings back when those happened in person, and giving testimony to the EPA or writing letters, signing petitions. People have been very involved with their state affiliates as well. And so we just want to say a word of gratitude for all of that work and all of the advocacy that has happened. And of course, you mentioned, Bill, that we heard a little bit of good news today on the court's ruling on the Trump Affordable Clean Energy Rule. And so I just want to invite you to say a little bit more about what happened today.
Yeah, so this was a big deal and kind of came as a surprise this morning. So very good news. Under Obama's EPA, the Clean Power Plan was established. And that set the first nationwide limits on carbon pollution. But under the EPA with Andrew Wheeler and the Trump administration, that plan was replaced with something that was called ACE, the Affordable Clean Energy Act. And this was far, far weaker, very damaging to allow a lot more power plant pollution to happen and to continue to happen. But today, the federal court struck down that climate change rule. And the US Court of Appeals new ruling will make it easier for the Biden administration to create rules that help drive the nation's power grid toward net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2035. So this is very significant. This creates a beautiful opportunity as the Biden-Harris administration gets started to be able to look at, again, addressing carbon pollution from power plants through the EPA.
That's fantastic news. And we're glad that was one of the final things that happened before the transition tomorrow. And it will hopefully make our work easier as well moving forward. And Bill, I just wondered if you could share, as we do look to the new administration, what specific EPA safeguards is IPL and our partners, what are we tracking as we look to the incoming Biden administration and new EPA leadership, and what might we expect?
Yeah. Well, as we mentioned, the two things that we've been tracking most recently have been clean cars and methane pollution. And now clearly we'll be tracking again the Clean Power Plan and kind of the next steps with addressing pollution from power plants. So those are really the three big things. In terms of opportunities, one of the things is really to push harder, to push further. So with methane, for example, there is a possibility that the Biden administration would say, hey, we want a quick win, and we're going to just reinstate the rules that had been in place before. And what we want to do is push further than that, because we know in the past few years, we've learned so much about methane pollution and how damaging it is, how much more methane pollution is leaking from the oil and gas industry and from both the drilling, the transportation, the storage. All of this is leaking methane, which is this powerful climate pollutant. And so we want to try to push even further and instate rules that really take account of the latest science.
That's great. And Bill, I know with the clean cars rule and the fuel efficiency standards, folks have heard probably a lot of the back and forth between California and California standards and the pushback with the current EPA administration and wanting to do away with the California's ability to set its own standards. And I wonder if you wanted to comment a little bit on sort of where that is now. And in particular, we had a big push around some of the auto manufacturers and trying to hold them to account to really stick with the higher California standards. Do you want to say a word about where any of that is or what's happened with the auto manufacturers on that front?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is really important to say is what you stated earlier, which is, it's so important for people to be engaged with IPL at the national level, and it's so important for people to be engaged with IPL at the state level as well, and be connected to their state affiliate. Because the clean cars rule is a perfect example, because so much of that fight had moved to the state level, and it will continue to move to the state level as well as move back to the federal level now. So a lot of what's happened is other states are signing on to the California standards that were mentioned in the film. And so, we have Virginia, I think, is the state that is looking at that right now. That fight will continue at the state level. And so it's important that people be speaking up at the state level, be looking at if their state can join that fight and be a part of it, as well as the national fight that will continue. What we've seen with the auto manufacturers is that they're starting to peel off and be supportive again of a stronger clean car standard. So when this all originally happened, when the Trump administration began, Ford was one of the leaders in going to the Trump administration and saying, hey, we want weaker standards. When those weaker standards came out, Ford and a lot of the other manufacturers were actually surprised at how weak the Trump administration tried to make them. And Ford peeled off and said, no, we're not going to support the Trump administration. We're going to support California. Now, we had the Faith the Ford campaign, which was part of that effort to get Ford to make the right decision and not support weakening those standards. GM made the announcement too in late November also to step away from supporting the weaker standards with the Trump administration and to support the stronger standards. So we're seeing that move in the right direction. And clearly now, as we move into the new administration, we'll see more opportunities for action.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. And of course, we're talking a lot about EPA rulemaking this evening, and of course, that's where the film was. But I also wanted to just lift up and have you share a little bit, just a quick synopsis of a piece of legislation that IPL is tracking that's really relevant to our conversation this evening, and that is the Environmental Justice for All Act. And I wondered if you might be able to just say a word or two about that for the folks on our webinar tonight.
Yeah, I sure can. So this was introduced about a year ago. It was introduced in the House by Representative McEachin from Virginia and Grijalva from Arizona. And we had a call with Representative McEachin. We talked a little bit about this. So, another reason to make sure that you're signed up on our list is to be able to attend these calls and hear about them. But the goal was to elevate environmental justice in federal policy. And so that piece of legislation came out, and there were a couple of features that I'll talk about. Created a federal energy transition economic development assistance fund paid for through new fees on oil and gas and coal companies to support communities and workers as they transition away from greenhouse gas dependent economies. So something that we've been fighting for a long time at Interfaith Power and Light. Requires federal agencies to consider cumulative health impacts under the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act in making permitting decisions, and ensures that permits will not be issued if projects cannot demonstrate a reasonable certainty of no harm to human health. So these are things that Reverend Mullen was talking about, the kinds of environmental justice, kind of common sense decisions that we want to see happening and really encapsulated in federal legislation.
That's fantastic. And certainly as we find ways to advocate more around that, we will be, as Bill said, sharing that information out. So if you're not already signed up on our list, please do sign up so you can get those action alerts and be a part of that advocacy. And Bill, the other thing I was going to just lift up, and actually Melanie touched on it already, but IPL and our partners put out a set of faith principles, with faith being the acronym. And this was a way to sort of center our minds on what we as faith-based organizations are really asking for in policy advocacy. And I'm just wondering if you could, again, share what those stand for and why they're important. And I think Sarah is also going to drop those in the chat for folks so you can actually see them as well.
Yeah, please take a look in the chat to see the link. But I do want to say, I was particularly thrilled to see these happen. I mean, this was a year-long process with many, many faith organizations to come up with these faith principles for climate action. And we work with a lot of different partners, including the environmental community, the faith community, and other communities. And the environmental community is a fantastic partner, a critical partner. But to have these faith principles where the faith community is talking about what we need for climate action and for climate solutions is so critical to this legislation moving forward. So when we talk about the faith principles, as Reverend Hendershot said, we have faith as the acronym. So F for faith, frontline, vulnerable and BIPOC communities must be supported first. A, accelerate the transition to clean energy, to the clean energy economy, and commit to net zero climate pollution and electricity by 2035 and economy-wide by 2050. The I is for invest in climate resiliency and sustainable infrastructure. The T is for transition our workforce to clean energy jobs and support and job training for workers. And the H is for honor creation by promoting protection and conservation of public lands and oceans. Almost sounds like we could make a children's book out of this.
Maybe that's next. And certainly this is This has been really important to our faith-based partners, as Bill said, and really important for grounding us in our work. And one thing that we know is that we are hearing more and more policymakers, members of Congress, who are talking about their faith and why their faith is motivating them to take certain positions. And that, in fact, we've heard Speaker Pelosi talk specifically about acting on climate change because she's grounded in her Catholic faith, and it's about caring for God's creation. And so I think it's really important for us to remember as faith-based advocates that we shouldn't shy away from that language. It's really important for our policymakers to hear why this is important for us, and certainly the moral and ethical framework and being grounded in our faith and what it calls us to do is a really important piece of this motivation. So again, I just want to invite you, if you're not already on our list, on our email list, please do jump on, join us, because we can share lots of information with you, whether it's about upcoming programs or webinars like this one, and action alerts and other types of information. So we really do want you to join into the IPL community as a part of this. And we're going to actually turn to questions here in just a moment. I'm going to invite Sarah on to join us, who's been tracking questions for us. And as we're doing that, I'm just wondering, Reverend Mullen, if you had any reflections from anything that Bill shared with us so far.
I'm so excited that Bill is closely tracking his policies. I think for a lot of times for people of faith, you might feel like we're a little bit on the outside, but all of these pieces were a part of this big year-long work of interfaith and ecumenical folks coming together to put together this wish list. And it's really exciting to think that that these bits of policy from my former representative, Senator McKeachin in Virginia, are actually possibly going to happen. And that emphasizes to me, not only is faith a piece of what structures why we do what we do, or perhaps care for creation is so important, but also, Susan, you and I were both at the COP and thinking about the importance of faith actors as important civil society leaders. We're not just people outside agitating, shouting into the wind, but we are people who represent the local communities and interests and how people's lives are important and what people really want to see happen in the world. So, so faith is not just what we hope for or what's motivating us, but it's also a bit of why we're important in these conversations and in making policy happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think for those who aren't familiar with the language, COP is the Conference of Parties. It's the UN climate change conference that is generally annual, although of course it was not held this year due to COVID. It was pushed back to 20 or to, it wasn't held in 2020 due to COVID. It was pushed back to later in 2021 in November. And I think it's particularly important to note that one of the actions that the president-elect has said that he's going to take on day one of his administration is to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And we know that IPL supporters around the country were very active in supporting the Paris Agreement. And also when the Trump administration decided to pull out of the Paris Accord, we had the We're Still In campaign. And, many of our congregations, individual supporters signed the Paris Pledge and still pledged to reduce their emissions. And so I think it's a real testimony to the work that has continued to happen throughout these past 4 years, that the incoming president and his administration heard very clearly that this is important to us, and we need to rejoin Paris. We need to rejoin the global community fighting to lower carbon emissions. And I think to Bill's point earlier, the fact that we've learned a lot in the past 4 years. And in fact, what we really need is to rejoin Paris and commit to going even farther in our commitment than what we had done when we originally joined. So I think the work that can happen on the ground here is for folks to continue to push the new administration to go farther than our old commitments on some of these things had been. And Bill, I'm going to throw a question to you, and that is, we had one question about how much of the Trump administration environmental rollbacks were done through executive orders that President Biden can just reverse, and how much is deeper rooted in law that will become difficult to remove. And you may not know all the ins and outs, but a little kind of top lines, if you have them, would be great.
Sure. It is a good question, and I don't say I have the absolute answer, but I would say the majority of it has been done through rules that can be undone. Now it's going to take some time to undo it because there's a process, and that's absolutely appropriate that there should be a process. But I would say, quite a bit of what has been done has been through administrative rules.
And that's great. And Bill, when you say there's a process, can you describe that for folks a little bit, for those who aren't familiar with the administrative rulemaking process? What are some of the pieces of that?
Sure. I mean, as we talked about a little bit earlier, typically for any of these rules to happen or to get undone, there is a comment period and often public hearings. And so those are the times when we find out about the timing of those, where we let our network know about that, and we encourage people and help them to be engaged in that public process. So they have typically maybe 30 days or 60 days to comment. And the hearings, well, right now they'll be virtual, so it'll be quite easy for people all across the country to attend. Typically, outside of a pandemic, those hearings might happen in 4 cities in the country. And so then it's up to the people in those cities and the surrounding areas to come and attend. And we're always working to organize people of faith and clergy to go and attend those meetings and to speak on behalf of what is right and the work of Interfaith Power and Light and the faith community around these issues.
And Melanie, that leads me to a question for you. Bill talked about, having faith leaders turn up at these hearings or comments. We know faith leaders oftentimes will write letters to the editor or op-eds, things that where they can really use their voice and their platform. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit more about why it is so important for faith leaders to feel empowered to take these types of actions.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us in the faith community, if you aren't already an activist, it might seem like a new way to get involved. But a couple of things we've learned is that we hear from folks who are writing legislation that faith communities are places, and some of the few places left where citizens are organized. People used to say you organize in churches because that's where the people are. There are places where people can speak very clearly. There are places where people tend to be more informed about their local communities and what's happening there. Folks in churches and synagogues read the newspaper and they vote. So the voice of faith leaders is really important, and it's one that legislators want to listen to. And secondly, because people are looking for ways to make the world a better place, they come to their faith community for education about ethics and about community standards. We find that being able to, number one, make sure your religious leader is aware and literate about environmental issues, pollution, climate change, will help the faith community as a whole learn to speak to those issues and be able to make the connections and connect the dots as well. It helps all the health of the community if a faith community knows how to articulate its needs, and legislators listen. Yeah.
That's great. I've often heard it described as faith leaders have sort of three voices to use in the climate crisis, and one is practical, sort of leading on what can we do in our place of worship, what types of actions can we take. And of course we share a lot of information around that with our Cool Congregations programming about lowering our energy use and very practical solutions. The second is pastoral, because we know that people of faith are suffering. There's a lot of grief in working on climate and environmental justice issues, and a lot of grief in knowing what's happening in our world today and the kind of world that we're passing on to future generations. And so the pastoral care role is really, really important. But the third, of course, is the prophetic role, and that is, how can we really speak to the vision that we have for the future that we want to live into. And I think that's such an important role for faith leaders, and one that, of course, in the Judeo-Christian tradition is very grounded in Scripture. So, I want to encourage folks to just remember those sort of three P's of practical, pastoral, and prophetic that need to happen.
Love it.
And we had a question, Bill, this might be for you, but are there major corporation leaders who are supportive in making changes for cleaner air? So we know that there are, but I wondered if you wanted to sort of name a few of the businesses, because we know that businesses do have, a leadership role here.
Yeah, boy, that's a big question. Hey, I first want to give a shout out to Reverend Mel Caraway. I saw that he responded to my last question and said there was only one hearing for the methane work that happened that he attended, and that is true. I hope that that's not the case moving forward under the Trump administration. In that case, there was only one hearing. You really want to allow people to have a voice, and so you want to have several hearings around the country, and I expect moving forward we will see that. But I do want to say thank you to him for his work with Texas Interfaith Power and Light and the work that we did at that methane hearing a couple years ago. As far as corporations go, absolutely. I mean, a lot of corporations have statements, a lot of corporate leaders have made statements. I think you do have to differentiate between the kind of greenwashing, the fake statements, and the true ones. And that's, part of all of our work to try to discern that and be good citizens in terms of our purchasing from companies that are doing good. There is an organization called Ceres that works specifically with the business community. And so they are, trying to bring the business community's voice to the table to make good climate policy. So there are certainly some companies that stand out in their activism for making climate change a top priority.
Absolutely. And Bill, that kind of leads into another question that we have, which is about building broad coalitions. And I wondered if you wanted to just say a few words about how IPL works with others as a part of this movement, both within and outside of other faith communities and faith organizations.
Yeah, it's a good question. IPL works very largely with the faith community, trying to really bring the faith voice to climate action. But IPL also works very heavily with the environmental community. The environmental community is well resourced in some ways, at least compared to the faith community around this work. And so we rely on many of our environmental partners to help us with the policy analysis and to bring some resources to the table that help us to do our work and to get our voice out there and to base the work that we're doing on science, as we, the faith community, also base it on our faith values. So yeah, we're constantly looking for other coalitions to work with and other organizations to work with. But the two largest sectors would be the faith community and trying to bring that faith voice to the table, and the environmental community.
Thanks, Bill. And Melanie, this is a really great question. You know, one of our viewers said the film did an excellent job of connecting the dots between human injustice and environmental/climate issues. Have denominations and national faith leaders made statements for just economic transition? And if so, is there an effort to bring these statements to bear in aggregate on national policy? And I wondered if you could speak to that from your experience.
Oh, I love that question because it's given me ideas. As far as I know, most denominations have either had some legislation in your internal body, or perhaps the religious leaders or authorities have made statements. I think, and I've just from a cursory point of view, perhaps we are increasing our skill and ability of making those statements really public outside of your church or your denomination, religious community. That said, the statements being made by even our Episcopal leaders, I can speak to my own tradition, are ones where I don't think we realize until just now how important they are. But year after year, we have our executive body and our bishops as a body have endorsed in a finer detail places where they want to stand up and say things about climate change, adaptability, increasing our ambition targets, removing environmental racism. And so those are statements that I think, I love this question. It reminds us that we should do a better job letting people know that these are things that people of faith think about, and as an entire denomination. But as far as I know, almost every denomination has had some statement or some legislation that allows them to do this work within their church and on the Hill and in public.
Often the trick is getting it from the upper echelons, shall we say, down into the folks on the ground and
folks
in the grassroots. It's sometimes hard to, and then also, you know, there's the question of sort of what are the tools, right? You know, you can make a statement, but what are the tools to implement that? We hope that that's a place that Interfaith Power and Light can be helpful, because we do provide some very practical tools as well, and some practical ways to get involved, as well as our state affiliates on the ground, as Bill mentioned before. Bill, so we had a question about, you know, the question is, can you offer a summary of what damage has been done to the Clean Air Act during the last administration? It's a pretty long list, so that might not be completely possible. And we talked a little bit about what can be done going forward, and they asked in particular, what can they do to help? And I think that's a great question. So I'll turn it over to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that is a great question. What you can do to help as far as the specific things that we're talking about with the EPA right now is make sure you're on our list, make sure you're paying attention to the emails, because that's our job, is to track this complicated information and make sure that we tell you when the right time is to act, when you have an opportunity to make your voice heard. So that would be first and foremost. There will be a lot of opportunities coming up because there's a lot of rulemaking to undo. So there will be those comment periods, there will be those hearings, those will all be opportunities, and we'll be organizing around that with our faith partners, with our environmental justice partners and our environmental partners to try to amplify the voice and make sure that we're speaking loud and clear. We're getting into the public discourse. We're trying to get into our local newspapers and into social media. So all of these things are important. And that brings me back to, you know, beyond the specific thing that we're talking about now with the EPA and these rules, in general, one of the things that you can do is talk about climate. One of the things that we know is that this is an issue that people are uncomfortable with oftentimes. It can be a difficult issue to talk about. Sometimes it's easier just to kind of remain silent. We can't do that. We need to talk about it. Now we need to talk about it in a way that we engage people and can talk from where they are, but we do need to speak up about it. So if people can do that with their friends and with their family and get comfortable and then take the next step to write a letter to the editor of your local newspaper or to do some social media outreach These things are always helpful to get that issue into the public discourse and get people talking about it. That's how it gets on the policy agenda.
Thanks, Bill. That's fantastic advice. And of course, we also urge you again to get involved with your state affiliate in your state. If you're not sure if there is an affiliate in your state, you can go to interfaithpowerandlight.org, and there is a map there that will show all the state affiliates, and you can click on that. It'll take you right to their information and their page. So we want to connect you both at the local level and at the national level as we work together to make change and make real progress on environmental and climate justice in the new administration. We are about out of time, and so I apologize if we did not get to your question. Please feel free to reach out to us. We're dropping a link for our info@interfaithpowerandlight.org into the chat. You can reach out to us there. And as well, to get involved, we have a link for you to sign up for our email list, and you can click on that and also share it with those in your network, because we feel like this is a very special community, and we're really excited that you're a part of it. And so as we kind of come to a close, I want to first invite Bill. Do you have any other reflections that you want to share? Any final comments?
I think what I mostly would like to share is thank you to everyone who's joining this. We just can't do this without you, and we need your voice there. And we need you to reach out to your friends and family and get them engaged, because your voice to them is the most important. You're the one who's going to be able to help bring them on board and help them to make this a critical issue when everyone's time is limited. There's a lot to be done, and you have to explain to them why this is so important.
Thanks, Bill. And feel free to drop your thanks in the chat box for our speakers. We'll share that with them after we wrap up. But Reverend Mullen, any final comments and thoughts from you this evening?
I just want to say that in our tradition, we always talk a lot about the beloved community, this idea that we are neighbors and we are inextricably linked to one another, and caring for the earth and caring for those who cannot care for themselves is a part of our responsibility. So this is an exciting time on the eve of a new administration to help lift up what should be go without saying, but doesn't always go without saying, that everyone has a right to clean air, clean water, and that we look after those who are the most vulnerable amongst us. And that includes doing the work for making sure that our environment can sustain healthy and well-being lives. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks to both of you for being with us this evening. I'm glad to have you as my guests. And we look forward to sharing future webinars with you. So please stay with us and keep checking back in on our emails and so on. And we will look forward to convening with you again in the very near future. Blessings to all of you.